The convoys started moving before sunrise, long before the desert air turned sharp and hot. Engines idled in slow, uneven rhythm as drivers tightened straps, checked mirrors, and waited for the signal that would send them onto the most dangerous stretch of road in the region. Everyone knew what waited out there. They knew the pattern, the timing, and the way ambushes seemed to appear from nothing. 5 seconds of quiet followed by chaos. For months, convoys had been moving along the same supply route, a narrow corridor cut between low hills and abandoned villages. It was a road that commanders needed but drivers hated. The terrain swallowed sound and visibility. A column could be attacked from above, from behind, or from both sides at once. It didn't matter if the trucks were armored, escorted, or spaced farther apart. The enemy understood this ground better than anyone, and they used that advantage every day. Most ambushes followed the same script: a buried charge or roadside explosive to stop the laid vehicle, a second one to trap the convoy, then gunfire from hidden positions, short bursts that forced drivers to crouch behind their steering wheels as bullets struck metal panels and shattered windshields. Survivors said the sound came all at once: the blast, the gunfire, the shouting over the radio, the grinding of stalled truck engines. If drivers reacted incorrectly for even a moment, the entire column could be lost. It reached a point where crews no longer cared about the danger itself. What they feared was the predictability. Every formation they used had already been studied. Every spacing template had already been countered. Every trick, every adjustment, every shift in timing, the enemy learned faster than they did. Convoys became long, slow targets, easy to time and even easier to surround. In the middle of this frustration, one of the youngest drivers in the battalion kept noticing something the others overlooked. He had no rank beyond corporal, no special training, no official authority to redesign anything, but he spent hours watching the pattern of attacks when they happened, where they started, and who always got hit first. While the rest of the unit focused on armor, weapons, and enemy positions, he focused on something else entirely: how convoys looked from the attacker's point of view. To him, the real problem wasn't speed, armor, or spacing. It was predictability. Every convoy moved like a straight, stretched line on the map. Every truck followed the one ahead of it. Every turn looked the same. Drivers stayed in their lanes, maintained regulated gaps, and created a formation that made perfect sense for logistics but terrible sense for survival. On paper, it was efficient. In reality, it was a blueprint for ambush timing. From high ground or from windows, attackers needed only seconds to judge distance, adjust aim, and coordinate fire. When trucks moved in a simple, unchanging line, the convoy practically guided the ambushers on when to strike. Even if the road twisted, the formation did not. Drivers followed the vehicle ahead like shadows. The corporal realized something simple. If the enemy could predict the convoy would always lose. He started watching how flocks of birds adjusted to threats. He watched how motorcades moved in crowded cities. He studied videos of rally drivers weaving through unpredictable terrain. The idea forming in his mind wasn't a tactic, at least not at first. It was a pattern, something that changed shape constantly without breaking the flow of movement. He wondered what would happen if a convoy stopped being a line at all. At the time, drivers had no reason to listen to him. He was quiet, young, and more analytical than most. But unpredictability was the one weapon the enemy couldn't counter easily. A shift in speed or a change in lane meant little, but a shift in formation, if done correctly, could destroy the timing of an ambush entirely. It could make attackers misjudge distance, fire too early, or reveal themselves before they were ready. It might even force them to delay attacks long enough for the convoy to pass untouched. This was the beginning of the idea, simple, untested, and almost ridiculous. A formation so unusual that officers dismissed it immediately. A pattern that looked chaotic but was actually controlled. A movement that made no sense unless you understood how ambush teams operated. But the corporal understood something others didn't. Ambushers were counting on predictability. Take that away and their advantage collapses. In the weeks ahead, he would refine the idea, test it quietly among willing drivers, and develop it into a maneuver that completely changed how convoys survived. No new armor, no new weapons, no expensive equipment, just a pattern, a shifting shape on the road that attackers couldn't decode fast enough. A formation that would reduce ambush losses by nearly 90%. The early morning briefings inside the convoy yard always carried the same quiet tension. Drivers stood beside their trucks, listening to intelligence officers recite the latest ambush reports. The patterns were grim: burned-out vehicles on Route Red, missing fuel haulers on Route Blue, entire supply chains delayed or destroyed in a single strike. Everyone knew the danger, and everyone knew the ambushers were learning faster than the convoys were adapting. But Corporal Hale noticed something strange. He watched the map the intel officer pointed to every morning. The red pins marking ambushes always clustered in the same stretches of road, always where the terrain narrowed, always where sound died before it carried. These were predictable kill zones, the kind every driver feared. Yet Hale realized something that intelligence had overlooked. The ambushes didn't happen at random. They happened after the convoys spread out. To everyone else, spread out meant safety. More distance meant fewer vehicles lost in a single blast. But Hale's mind worked differently. He spent hours behind a windshield watching wind patterns on the dust trails, listening to how engines echoed off canyon walls, studying how local fighters reacted to noise more than sight. And one night, long after everyone else had turned in, he stood by the fence line staring at those red pins again. The idea hit him hard, simple, and almost embarrassing. Ambushers weren't reacting to the trucks. They were reacting to the gaps. Gaps meant separation. Separation meant vulnerability. Vulnerability told the enemy, now. He carried this thought through the next mission, replaying it as the convoy rolled into the rising sun. He noticed how every time the lead vehicles rounded a bend, the sound of the engines thinned. The attackers did not see them. They heard the silence between engines, the rhythm that shifted from a rolling thunder to a scattered drumming. Silence was the signal. Midway through the route, as the convoy entered a canyon notorious for ambushes, Hale leaned forward in his seat, studying the dust trails stretching behind each vehicle. He watched the shapes, the density, the way wind pulled them apart, and a realization washed over him. The convoy didn't look like one unit. It looked like scattered prey. That evening he sketched an idea on scrap paper: arrows, circles, timings. It didn't look like a battlefield plan. It looked like choreography. Every motion depended on the next, every spacing precise, every driver in sync. It was not a defensive tactic. It was a moving formation. A formation built to confuse ambushers before they could fire. But when he presented the idea to his platoon leader, the reaction was predictable: a quiet stare, a raised brow, a sigh. Corporal, drivers don't do formations. We keep spacing, that's the doctrine. Hale nodded, but he didn't give up. Instead, he asked for one chance, one test run at dawn when the yard was empty. Maybe they wouldn't approve it for missions, but at least they would see it. The lieutenant reluctantly agreed. And the next morning, as the sky shifted from blue to gold, 9 trucks rolled out in a pattern no convoy had ever attempted. Drivers looked confused. Some laughed. One muttered, "What is this, a parade?" But as they moved, something unusual happened. The dust didn't trail off in separate plumes. It merged. It spread wide. It looked like a storm instead of a line of targets. Sound too began to blend. Instead of separate engines, the canyon ricochet created a rolling echo, one continuous roar that masked the vulnerable gaps. The lieutenant, who stood on a small ridge watching, slowly crossed his arms. He wasn't laughing anymore. Hale walked up beside him. "It's not about hiding trucks," he said quietly. "It's about hiding patterns." The lieutenant didn't respond immediately. He simply watched the trucks glide through the test route, weaving into a synchronized flow that looked more like a single massive vehicle than a string of individual targets. Finally, he nodded. "Corporal, this might actually work." Word spread quickly. By noon, senior NCOs came to watch the formation. By evening, whispers ran through the yard about Hale's crazy maneuver and the synchronized convoy stunt. And to some, it still looked ridiculous. But the new formation created the illusion of unpredictability, noise that carried in waves, dust that misled scouts, shadows that broke into shifting shapes. Ambushers relying on audio cues were thrown off entirely. And for the first time in months, the drivers felt they weren't just surviving the roads, they were outsmarting them. Hale stood alone that night, listening to the engines cooling across the yard. He didn't smile, he didn't celebrate, he only replayed the test in his mind, refining the idea further, tightening the pattern. The first field test wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It was meant to be a quiet, controlled trial on a stretch of road that had seen 3 ambushes in 7 days. Command wanted data, the drivers wanted reassurance, Hartley wanted proof. They rolled out just after sunrise, 15 trucks, every one of them patched, repaired, dented, and weary from weeks of non-stop movement. Engines trembled beneath their hoods, heavy with overuse, but for the first time in weeks, nobody argued about who sat where. Everyone wanted to be part of this experiment. Hartley walked the length of the convoy twice, checking every coupling, every mirror, every spacing marker he had hastily painted across their windshields. The mechanics hadn't slept, the drivers hadn't slept, Hartley definitely hadn't slept. But the formation, it looked steady, balanced, controlled. Like someone had finally pulled chaos into alignment. The first 5 miles were calm, too calm. Birds scattered across the treetops, the morning fog clung low. The only sound was the grind of gears and the rolling hum of engines trying to mask their own nerves. The drivers kept glancing at the tree line every few seconds out of habit. Old fear crawled back even when logic said everything was fine. And then, just after the 11th mile marker, the road curved left around a natural bottleneck, 2 ridgelines tightening into a narrow passage. It was the perfect place for an ambush. It had already been ambushed twice that month. The lead driver stiffened, the others instinctively slowed. But this is where Hartley's idea finally showed its teeth. Instead of stretching wide and leaving gaps that insurgents counted on, the trucks tightened, wheel to wheel, bumper to bumper, forming what Hartley had quietly named the box. From above, the formation no longer looked like a fragile line begging to be picked apart. It looked like a single, unified shape. A shape impossible to isolate. A shape impossible to dismantle one truck at a time. The rearguard mirrored the front, sliding into place with practiced timing, locking the formation together like a moving shield wall. Drivers leaned forward, hands gripping the wheel, not out of fear now, but out of anticipation. They were ready to test the impossible. And that was when the first shot cracked through the trees. Not a warning. Not a probing attack. A full burst, automatic fire ripping open the quiet morning. The old Hartley convoy would have panicked instantly. Every driver for himself. Some slamming brakes, others accelerating blindly, the line unraveling into chaos, exactly what ambushers waited for. But not today. The drivers held the formation. Tight, clean, controlled. No sudden braking, no scattering, no collapsing inward from fear. The trucks behind adjusted to every micro-movement of the truck ahead, like gears inside a single machine. Rounds tore across the ridge and shredded bark off trees. Dust clouds erupted around the tires. A ricochet clanged off a metal side panel. And still, nobody broke formation. For the first time in months, a convoy was not reacting like prey. It was responding like a system. The ambushers realized something was wrong. Their entire method relied on panic, on breaking the line, isolating a straggler, overwhelming one vehicle before moving to the next. But Hartley's formation offered them nothing. No stragglers, no gaps, no exposed soft target falling behind. The trucks didn't slow down, they didn't accelerate. They tightened, synchronized, absorbing the attack like a shield absorbing arrows. And when the convoy cleared the kill zone, still intact, still moving, every driver's brain replayed the same thought. It worked. Not partially. Not theoretically. Not maybe. It worked clearly, visibly, unmistakably. The attack that should have blown the convoy apart had failed without claiming a single truck. Not one tire. Not one engine. Not one driver. And for the first time since the convoys had started running that route, the enemy withdrew first. A full ambush team, beaten by timing, spacing, structure, and a man who had spent far too many nights staring at oil-stained maps and refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. The moment the trucks reached the forward outpost, the drivers climbed down in total silence. Not shock, just a deep, stunned understanding that something enormous had shifted. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. They had just witnessed the birth of a system that shouldn't have worked but did, and did so flawlessly. But the test wasn't over. Far from it. Because Hartley didn't just want to survive ambushes. He wanted to eliminate them. And in the next part of the story, the pattern he designed would begin spreading, quietly at first, then rapidly, through every road, every convoy, every battalion that heard what had happened. It unfolded on a long, exposed supply track that cut through low scrubland and rolling dust fields, terrain where ambushes had been happening almost weekly. The commanders were hesitant, and the drivers were uneasy, but the need for a solution outweighed the risks. The formation had to be proven in real conditions, against real threats, under pressure that no training scenario could replicate. And so the convoy rolled out in quiet tension, engines humming at synchronized intervals as if rehearsed, but each man aware that what happened next could either validate the system or condemn it. The lead driver held his pace exactly as the model dictated. The second driver mirrored the rhythm without hesitation. The third and fourth, positioned on the back right and back left of the triangular arrangement, adjusted their spacing inch by inch, constantly updating based on distance markers, dust plumes, shadows, and engine harmony. Their movements were small, controlled, and precise, exactly the kind of adjustments the original designer had insisted were necessary to avoid overcorrection and panic. They had traveled nearly 3 kilometers before the first sign of trouble appeared, a thin, rising distortion in the heat shimmer just ahead, the kind of distortion that meant someone somewhere had just stepped into position or that a weapon had been laid onto its firing rest. The drivers spotted it almost simultaneously. There was no spoken command. There didn't need to be. The formation responded exactly as they had trained. They tightened. Not enough to look abnormal to anyone watching, but enough for each driver to track the others, tail lights and dust patterns more easily. A second distortion emerged, this one off to the left. Still no noise, still no movement from the ridge line, but the convoy knew what was coming. In every previous ambush, this is where the attackers struck close enough to force chaos, far enough to retreat through defiles and disappear before support arrived. But as the convoy advanced, the attackers hesitated. Their field scouts had never seen a formation like this. The triangular arrangement threw off range estimations. It distorted apparent distances. It made the convoy seem like it was shifting its weight from side to side, even though every truck maintained perfect linear movement. In the first few seconds of the attack, the formation did exactly what it had been created for. The moment the ambushers opened fire, the trucks executed a subtle divergence, not a swerve, not a break, but a controlled lateral opening of the formation. The attackers had aimed at the spacing typical of normal convoys. Their rounds passed cleanly through the air where trucks usually traveled. The lead gunner returned fire immediately. The second truck lifted dust in controlled bursts to obscure line of sight. The rear trucks shifted their angles just enough to protect the center while keeping forward motion unbroken. The most surprising outcome wasn't the reduced damage, it was the attackers' reaction. They hesitated again. The formation's movement contradicted everything they expected. Instead of scattering or stopping or falling into disarray, the convoy moved almost like a single body, reshaping itself as it progressed. Gunfire continued, but it became increasingly inaccurate. The attack lacked the confidence of previous ones. The ambushers were not prepared to fight a convoy that refused to behave like a predictable target. As the convoy pushed through the danger zone, another strength of the system became clear. Because the drivers were trained to read each other's movement through spacing and rhythm rather than radio chatter, the internal communication remained uninterrupted. No one shouted commands. No one transmitted panic. Every driver stayed inside the quiet, constant discipline of the formation. It was this internal stability that prevented the chaos that attackers relied on. Without panic from the drivers, the ambushers lost the psychological advantage that usually forced convoys into mistakes. By the time the convoy had cleared the ridge line, the attackers had already abandoned their positions. They left behind spent casings, discarded firing rests, and a few scattered footprints in the dust. Aerial observation later confirmed that the ambush lasted less than half the usual duration. The attackers did not pursue. They did not attempt a second strike. They withdrew, confused by the convoy's behavior and uncertain whether they had just encountered a decoy, an armored escort disguised as cargo trucks, or a new system entirely. In the after-action review, the drivers noted something important. The formation did not feel heroic or desperate or improvisational. It felt stable, predictable, repeatable. The movements were so controlled that no driver experienced the adrenaline spike typical of previous ambushes. They described it almost mechanically, like executing a practiced maneuver on a training circuit. That was the real achievement. The system removed panic from the equation. It replaced instinct with structure, uncertainty with pattern, and fear with controlled expectation. This was only the first real-world test, but its implications spread quickly. If a formation could not only survive an ambush but reduce the attacker's confidence and disrupt their timing, then it was more than a defensive tactic. It was an offensive pressure, one that shifted the psychological balance of the battlefield without firing a shot. And the men who witnessed it firsthand understood immediately that this system could shape the convoy doctrine of the entire region. The report circulated upward. Commanders studied the diagrams, the telemetry, and the spacing charts. They compared casualty numbers from previous weeks. They compared the length of attacks, the patterns of withdrawal, and the timing of enemy fire. The pattern was undeniable. The new formation had not just survived an ambush, it had weakened the attacker's advantage in a measurable, repeatable way. The request for expanded deployment was approved within hours. And for the first time in months, convoy drivers felt the possibility of predictability returning to their missions. They felt the pressure in their shoulders ease, the quiet dread that came with every long road dim just slightly. The formation was still new, it still carried risk. But it had proven something no other tactic had accomplished, that order could exist inside chaos, and that a convoy could move through an ambush not as individual trucks, but as a single, unified pattern against which panic had no place to grow. The convoy pushed deeper into the contested valley, moving at the steady, disciplined rhythm the drivers had practiced for weeks. The formation looked almost ordinary to anyone watching from a distance, which was exactly the intention. Nothing about the spacing suggested deception. Nothing about the pacing hinted at the coordinated shifts happening inside the columns. And yet, every driver understood they were now inside the deadliest stretch of road in the entire region. The terrain funneled them toward the center, where ambushes had struck so often that units had stopped traveling it altogether. The radio operator in the lead vehicle spoke only once, quietly marking the moment they crossed the invisible line separating relative safety from near certain attack. The drivers did not change posture. They did not speed up or drift out of alignment. Their training demanded that everything remain calm and controlled until the exact second the plan was triggered. The first sign of danger was not a weapon or a muzzle flash, but movement along a ridgeline far ahead. One driver saw it, then another, and soon half the convoy recognized the familiar silhouette of scouts rotating into position. The ambush was coming, and it would land hard. The enemy had chosen the narrowest stretch of the valley, knowing it trapped vehicles between steep walls with no natural escape route. In every previous attack, this choke point turned convoys into immobile targets. But this time, the attackers didn't realize the drivers were operating under a new system, one built around the unorthodox idea that the entire column could reshape itself in seconds, absorbing the first blow while weakening the second. 3 seconds before the ambush detonated, a driver in the second row began the formation shift. It was so subtle that even someone staring directly at the convoy might have missed it. The spacing expanded by less than half a meter. The trucks behind mirrored the motion automatically. It was the first signal in a chain of coordinated adjustments, each linked to the next like falling dominoes. The formation widened, then compressed, then widened again, creating the exact spacing needed for the maneuver that had reduced ambush casualties by 90%. The first explosive charge detonated on the left side of the road. The shockwave slammed into the lead truck, lifting one side off the ground. Drivers in past convoys would have slammed their brakes in reflex, freezing the entire column. But now each driver applied pressure to the accelerator instead, maintaining forward movement. The formation held steady, absorbing the hit without collapsing. Then came the second explosion, a larger charge triggered by the enemy the moment they believed they had immobilized the lead vehicle. The moment the second blast hit, the formation shifted again. Trucks in the outer lanes angled inward, creating a wedge shape that redirected the explosive force away from the drivers behind them. The move looked instinctive, but it was the result of dozens of rehearsals, each designed to teach the drivers that their biggest weapon in an ambush wasn't armor or firepower. It was motion. Predictable, disciplined, mathematically spaced motion. Enemy gunfire opened next. Rifles, machine guns, and improvised positions erupted along both sides of the valley. The ambushers expected the convoy to panic, to scatter into the kill zone with no clear direction. Instead, the trucks tightened their formation just enough to present fewer exposed angles. Every driver knew exactly where they needed to be. They did not drift. They did not swerve. They did not accelerate independently. Uniform motion made targeting almost impossible for the gunmen, who suddenly found themselves staring at a convoy that behaved nothing like the ones they had hit before. The wedge shifted a second time, this one sharper and more aggressive. The entire convoy pivoted slightly to the right, forcing enemy shooters on the left ridge to adjust their aim while exposing the right side attackers to return fire from the security vehicles. The formation created a corridor of visibility that had never existed in earlier ambushes. Now, instead of being trapped, the convoy was shaping the battlefield around itself, using motion to carve openings that gun crews and support vehicles could exploit. The attackers realized something was wrong. Their usual strategy, overwhelming fire on the first 4 vehicles, was not producing the collapse they counted on. The convoy kept moving, weaving through ambush geometry with an almost unnatural precision. The center trucks were already past the deadliest arcs of fire, and the rear trucks were joining the protected corridor created by the wedge. The moment the attackers shifted their focus to the rear, the formation tightened again, minimizing exposure. It was the third shift that broke the ambush. With a timing that seemed impossible from the outside, the drivers altered their spacing to create a narrow gap between the second and third rows. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for the gun trucks stationed behind them to fire directly through the opening, hitting the ridge where enemy spotters had been directing the ambush. The attackers panicked, their firing lines collapsed, several abandoned their positions entirely. The convoy continued forward, still under fire but no longer vulnerable. The final stage of the formation change closed the temporary corridor and restored the original alignment, giving the last trucks enough protection to clear the narrow valley. When the convoy finally exited the ambush zone, the radio operator quietly marked their time. The drivers barely spoke. They did not shout in triumph or celebrate the fact that they had just survived the most coordinated, deadliest ambush zone in the region. They simply kept driving, their formation steady, their spacing perfect, each one aware that the maneuver had worked again. The shift had saved the column. It had protected the wounded. It had delivered supplies that commanders had assumed would never make it through. And somewhere in the valley behind them, the attackers were left with a single, unanswered question: how a group of drivers had turned a series of trucks into a weapon that could reshape the battlefield with nothing more than timing, geometry, and discipline.